Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Midnight Files. Tonight, you'll hear 12, a true story about crime, disappearance, and miraculous survival. If you like it, hit like, subscribe so you can follow more fascinating stories, and let me know where you're listening and what time it is. Before we begin, please check your door locks, and maybe take a look out the window. Okay, let's get started. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. At first, just a few scattered drops, tapping lightly on the window pane. Then it grew heavier, more consistent, until the sound of the rain became a white curtain, swallowing up all other sounds. The streets turned into small rivers, and the night sank into an eerie silence. It was on a night like this, at San Luis, Argentina, that a local truck driver was navigating Route 222. He had no idea that in a few hours, the very men who had sworn an oath to protect the citizens of this province would be the ones pointing a high-caliber weapon at his chest while he pleaded for his life in the mud. He thought he was stopping to help a fellow traveler in distress, but he was actually walking straight into a meticulously planned execution. But before we delve into that story, let's rewind time a little to the year 2000. The province of San Luis in central Argentina is known for its vast, open landscapes and long stretches of highway that seem to disappear into the horizon. In the year 2000, Route 222 was a critical artery for logistics, carrying everything from grain to expensive electronics across the country. It was a lonely road, especially after the sun dipped below the mountains, leaving only the hum of tires on the cold asphalt. For the truck drivers who spent their lives on these roads, the night was a companion they respected but also feared. They knew the dangers of fatigue and the occasional mechanical failure, but a new kind of shadow was beginning to stretch across the Pampa. Rumors began to circulate at the roadside diners and rest stops about a phantom that was haunting the asphalt. They called it the ghost of the highway, and its presence meant certain death for some. It started with reports of a stranded motorist, someone parked on the narrow shoulder of the road with their hazard lights blinking weakly against the darkness. To a passing driver, it looked like a neighbor in trouble. In the culture of the Argentine interior, you do not leave someone behind in the middle of nowhere. It is a matter of survival. But every time a Good Samaritan pulled over to offer assistance, the script of their life was rewritten. As soon as the victims stepped out of their vehicle, the shadows would materialize into men with cold eyes and steady hands. They did not look like common thieves. They moved with a disturbing level of precision and tactical awareness. They knew exactly where to stand to stay out of the headlights, and they knew exactly how to speak to keep their victims off balance. Before the driver could even say a word, they were staring down the barrel of a pistol. These attacks were not just simple robberies. They were surgical strikes. The attackers would seize the cargo, often worth hundreds of thousands of pesos, and then they would deal with the witnesses. In several cases throughout the early months of 2000, the bodies of these drivers were found miles away from their trucks, discarded in the brush like trash. The violence was escalating, and the local population was becoming paralyzed by a deep, cold fear. The investigators in San Luis were baffled because the perpetrators seemed to know exactly when the official police patrols were passing through. It was as if they had a copy of the shift schedules or could listen in on the encrypted radio frequencies. They would strike in the small gaps of time when the road was unmonitored, appearing and disappearing like smoke. This led the media to lean into the supernatural name, suggesting a phantom was at work. However, the detectives on the case knew that ghosts do not carry 9mm rounds or know how to operate heavy machinery. They began to look inward. They realized that the level of logistical knowledge required to pull off these heists was professional. The killers knew the routes, the cargo manifests, and the response times of the local precinct. A terrifying suspicion began to take root in the minds of the lead investigators in late August. What if the people they were looking for were sitting in the same briefing rooms as they were? What if the ghost of the highway was wearing a blue uniform during the day? This thought sent a chill through the department. If the killers were members of the security forces, then no one was safe. The investigation was moved to a secret task force to prevent leaks, as they realized any officer they spoke to could potentially be a member of this lethal gang. The breakthrough came during a cold night in November of 2000. A veteran driver had managed to survive an encounter by diving into a deep drainage ditch and hiding while the hijackers searched for him with high-powered flashlights. He noticed something small but significant. One of the men was wearing a pair of tactical boots that were only issued to the provincial police force. He also heard them using specific codes over a handheld radio unit. This witness description gave the task force the leverage they needed to start tracking internal equipment logs. They discovered that a small group of former and active duty officers had been checking out gear that was not accounted for during their off hours. These men were led by a charismatic but cold individual who had been dismissed from the force years prior for disciplinary issues. He had recruited his former colleagues into a lucrative criminal cell. They had turned the highway into their personal hunting ground. Using their knowledge of patrol patterns, they ensured they would never be interrupted while they stripped trucks of their valuable goods. They used the authority of their former positions to flag people down, sometimes even using fake sirens to pull over unsuspecting victims. It was the ultimate betrayal of the public trust, and it had been happening right under the noses of the high command. In December of 2000, a massive sting operation was launched. The task force utilized an undercover truck filled with dummy boxes and a team of elite shooters hidden in the back. As the vehicle rolled down Route 222, the trap was set. Sure enough, a car with flashing lights pulled them over. When the gang approached the cabin, expecting an easy score, the doors burst open and the night was filled with the sounds of justice. The subsequent trial exposed the deep rot within the provincial security forces. It was revealed that the gang had been responsible for at least 5 deaths and dozens of high-value thefts. The image of the police in San Luis was shattered, leading to a total overhaul of the department. The ghost of the highway was finally unmasked, and it turned out to be the very face of the law. The people of Argentina would never look at a patrol car the same way. As the people of San Luis realized their protectors were actually predators thousands of miles away in Mexico City, a different kind of darkness was taking root in the narrow alleys of Iztapalapa. While the Argentine highway was a place of open space and sudden violence, the borough of Iztapalapa was a dense labyrinth where secrets could be buried behind thick concrete walls and heavy steel padlocks, and where children were beginning to vanish. Would you like me to write story 2? In the sprawling expanse of Mexico City, there is a borough called Iztapalapa that feels less like a residential area and more like a living, breathing organism of brick and mortar. By the year 2000, this territory had become one of the most densely populated spots on the entire planet, with millions of people packed into vertical spaces. The air was thick with the scent of street food and exhaust, and the sound of life was a constant roar. The dwellings here are not organized like the wide boulevards of the city center. Instead, they are a chaotic tangle of narrow passages and steep hillsides. In this crowded world, everyone is a stranger, yet everyone is observed by 1,000 eyes. But in 2000, those eyes began to fail the most vulnerable members of the community. It started with a single youngster who walked to a corner market for bread and simply never returned to their waiting mother. Soon, another youngster vanished, and then another. Each disappearance followed a similar, agonizing pattern. A young boy or girl would be sent on a quick errand, something they had done 100 times before, only to evaporate into the heavy afternoon heat. The families would search frantically, calling names into the labyrinth of cinder block structures, but the only answer they received was the distant hum of traffic and the indifferent chatter of the markets. The anxiety in Iztapalapa became a physical presence, a cold weight that sat on the chest of every parent in the borough. They began to notice a specific man who resided in a small, unassuming structure on a quiet side street. He was a quiet individual, the kind of person you might see every day but never actually acknowledge. He kept to himself, rarely speaking to neighbors, and his windows were always covered by thick blankets that blocked out every sliver. Rumors began to circulate among the residents that something was deeply wrong behind those walls. People spoke of strange noises in the middle of the afternoon, muffled sounds that did not belong in a residential zone. Despite the growing suspicion, the local lawmen seemed uninterested in investigating a man who had not technically broken any visible rules. This lack of response created a boiling resentment among the people who lived on his specific block. The parents knew that if they did not take matters into their own hands, more youngsters would be snatched. They started to organize, meeting in secret, in small kitchens and dim basements to share information and observations. They realized that the disappearances always happened within a few blocks of this man's residence. The geography of the crimes pointed directly at the nondescript door with the heavy iron bolt. It was a realization that brought dread. One afternoon in late 2000, a group of local fathers decided they had waited long enough for the state to act. They did not call the local station, they simply walked to the man's front entrance and demanded to be let inside. When he refused, they used a heavy iron bar to force their way into the dwelling. What they found was not a residence, but a nightmare constructed from wood and stone. The interior had been gutted and rebuilt into a small prison. The air inside the dwelling was stagnant and carried the metallic scent of old terror and unwashed bodies. As the men pushed deeper into the structure, they discovered a hidden staircase leading to a cellar that was not on any official architectural plan. There, in the dim glow of a single hanging bulb, they found the missing youngsters. They were huddled together in the corner of a cage, their eyes wide with a level of horror that no child should ever know. The man had created a literal dungeon in the heart of the most crowded city in North America. He had spent years refining his methods, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood so he could snatch his targets without being noticed. He was a predator who understood that in a place where everyone is seen, nobody is actually looked at. The revelation of his crimes sent a shockwave through the country, exposing a level of depravity that was previously unthinkable. When the investigators finally arrived to process the scene, they were met with a wall of angry residents. The people of Iztapalapa no longer trusted the state to protect them. They saw the arrest not as a triumph of justice, but as a failure of the system that had allowed this monster to operate for so long. The inquiry eventually linked the man to the disappearance of at least 5 youngsters, though many feared the actual number of his targets was higher. The case of the monster of Iztapalapa became a turning point for Mexican civil society. It was the moment when the average citizen realized that their safety was their own responsibility. In the wake of the horror, the first organized neighborhood watch groups began to form. These were not official organizations, but groups of neighbors who pledged to look out for one another and to act when the law would not. It was a new era of communal vigilance born of trauma. The man was sentenced to a long term in a maximum security facility, but the scars he left on the borough would never truly heal. Even years later, parents in Iztapalapa would hold their youngsters a little tighter when they walked past that quiet structure on the side street. The memory of the dungeon remained a chilling reminder that evil does not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it lives right next door, behind a familiar face and a very heavy padlock. As the people of Mexico City began to build their own walls of protection against the monsters in their midst, across the Atlantic Ocean, a different group of men was preparing to tear a wall down. In the heart of London, England, the focus was not on the safety of the vulnerable, but on a glittering prize that sat beneath a massive white canopy, protected by the most advanced security systems that the new Millennium could provide to the world's elite. Thanks for watching. The River Thames in London is a winding ribbon of history that has seen centuries of secrets pass along its murky banks. In the year 2000, the skyline of the Greenwich Peninsula was dominated by a massive white canopy held up by 12 yellow masts, known as the Millennium Dome. Inside this futuristic structure sat a treasure so valuable it seemed to belong in a museum of ancient legends rather than a modern exhibition hall in the heart of England. This treasure was the De Beers Millennium Star, a flawless, pear-shaped diamond weighing over 200 carats. It was surrounded by a collection of 11 rare blue gems, and together, the display was worth approximately £350 million. To the average person, it was a beautiful sight. But to a group of professional thieves, led by a man named Raymond Betson, it was the ultimate score that could change their lives forever. The plan these men devised was not one of stealth or quiet manipulation of security codes. Instead, they decided to use a combination of overwhelming physical force and a high-speed aquatic getaway. They knew the dome was protected by laser grids and sophisticated alarms, but they also knew that those systems were designed to stop people from sneaking in not to withstand a direct assault by heavy machinery moving at high speeds toward the center. To pierce the outer skin of the massive tent, the crew acquired a JCB earth mover, a piece of industrial equipment typically found on construction sites. They spent months modifying the vehicle, adding reinforced steel plating to the front so it could smash through the reinforced perimeter fences and the thick glass panels of the exhibition zone without stalling or sustaining damage to the engine. It was a battering ram designed for the new century. Their escape plan was equally ambitious. They realized that the London traffic would make a getaway by car impossible, so they focused on the river. They prepared a powerful speedboat that would be waiting just outside the dome on the banks of the Thames. The idea was to grab the jewels, sprint to the water, and disappear into the labyrinth of docks and industrial zones before the authorities could even process that a crime had been committed nearby. However, unknown to Raymond and his associates, the Metropolitan Police had been watching them for months. In an operation codenamed Christmas, the flying squad had utilized advanced surveillance techniques to track the gang's movements and listen to their conversations. They knew about the earth mover, they knew about the boat, and they even knew the exact date the raid was scheduled to occur. They were simply waiting for the thieves to commit. The most brilliant part of the police strategy involved a bit of sleight of hand. Several days before the planned heist, undercover officers removed the real diamonds from their display cases and replaced them with glass replicas that looked identical to the naked eye. If the thieves succeeded in breaking into the vault, they would be risking their freedom for worthless pieces of crystal. The trap was set, and the authorities were hidden in plain sight. On the morning of November 7th, 2000, the air over London was crisp and clear. Inside the Millennium Dome, dozens of undercover officers were disguised as maintenance workers, cleaners, and even tourists. Some were hiding in the rafters, while others were crouched behind temporary exhibition walls. They all had their eyes on the vault, waiting for the sound of the earth mover that would signal the beginning of the most daring raid in history. At approximately 9:30, the silence of the morning was shattered. The JCB earth mover roared to life and came crashing through the perimeter fence at the north side of the dome. It didn't stop for anything, flattening obstacles as it plowed through the outer skin of the structure. The thieves inside the cab were wearing gas masks and were prepared to deploy smoke grenades to create a screen of confusion that would mask their movements from the guards. As the heavy machine reached the inner jewelry vault, the thieves jumped out, armed with sledgehammers and specialized glass cutting tools. They tossed smoke canisters into the air, and within seconds, the area was filled with a thick, choking fog. They began to hammer away at the reinforced glass, protecting the fake diamonds, unaware that they were being watched by dozens of armed officers who were closing in from every single direction in the room. The sound of the sledgehammers hitting the glass was rhythmic and desperate. The men knew they only had a few minutes before the response team arrived, but they didn't realize the response team was already there. Just as the lead thief reached in to grab the Millennium Star, a voice boomed over the intercom system, and the cleaners nearby dropped their mops to reveal tactical weapon. The thieves were surrounded before they could even turn around. While the primary takedown was happening inside the vault, another team of officers was moving to intercept the getaway boat. The man waiting at the helm of the speedboat heard the commotion and tried to start the engines, but he found himself staring into the barrels of several rifles held by Marine Unit officers who had approached silently on the water. Every single member of the gang was apprehended within minutes of the initial breach of the perimeter. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The public was fascinated by the sheer audacity of the plan and the meticulous way the police had dismantled it. Raymond Betson and his crew were handed lengthy sentences, and the Millennium Star was returned to its secure storage facility, having never actually been in any real danger. It was a victory for the flying squad and a reminder that even the most elaborate heist can be undone by a single leak. The story of the Dome raid was one of high-tech protection and cold, calculated planning in a world of luxury. But as the millennium began, there were places where the structures of society were not just being tested by thieves, but were completely disintegrating. In the industrial heart of Russia, the city of Novokuznetsk was struggling with a level of poverty and decay that allowed a much darker kind of predator to operate in total and utter silence. In the frozen heart of Siberia, The industrial municipality of Novokuznetsk was a landscape of chimneys belching thick soot into a leaden sky. By the arrival of the year 2000, the residents were trying to survive the biting economic winds that followed the collapse of the old empire. The residence blocks were crumbling monuments to a failed dream where the pipes groaned and the heating was a luxury that few could afford during the brutal winter months. Within one of these gray towers, specifically on the 9th level of a masonry building on Pionersky Prospect, a horror had been festering for years that defied any rational explanation. While the public was aware that a man named Alexander Spasivtsev had been taken into custody, it was not until the legal proceedings of 2000 that the full, nauseating scale of his activities was revealed to a stunned nation by the forensic specialists and the local militia. The municipality itself felt like a place forgotten by time, a sprawl of rust and metal where the air tasted of sulfur and coal dust. The inhabitants lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion, navigating a world where the social safety nets had long since frayed into nothingness. It was in this environment of apathy and struggle that a predator found the perfect camouflage, blending into the shadows of a society that was too busy surviving to notice any missing souls. The investigators who entered that unit were seasoned professionals, used to the grim realities of the Siberian underworld, yet nothing could have prepared them for the atmosphere of Flat 357. The air was heavy with a cloying, sweet scent of rot that seemed to have soaked into the very wallpaper. Every surface was covered in a layer of grime that felt like a physical weight on the lungs of those who entered the small living quarters. Alexander, often called Sasha by his mother Ludmila, had transformed their modest dwelling into a slaughterhouse that operated with terrifying efficiency. The duo worked in tandem, with the elderly woman often acting as the primary lure for their targets. She would approach young females or teenagers at the local depots, using her frail appearance to gain their trust before inviting them back to their unit for a warm meal or a place to rest away from the wind. Once the unsuspecting guests stepped over the threshold, the metal bolt was slid into place and the trap was finalized. What followed was a descent into a private hell that lasted for days or even weeks. The mother would sit in the tiny kitchen, casually listening to music or boiling water for tea, while her son performed unspeakable acts in the back room. The level of apathy she displayed was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case brought to light. By the time the year 2000 forensic audit reached its peak, the specialists had to meticulously sift through the drains and the floorboards to find evidence of those who had vanished. They discovered that the pair had been disposing of the remains by grinding them up and flushing them through the communal waste pipes. This was why the other tenants had frequently complained about blockages and a foul odor that never seemed to dissipate from the hallways. The quantification of the tragedy was a grim task that involved matching fragments of bone and teeth to the list of 80 missing individuals from the surrounding districts. The investigators eventually confirmed that at least 19 juveniles had met their end within that small square footage. Each discovery was a blow to the community, as it became clear that the system had ignored the screams emanating from the vents for nearly a decade without any intervention. During the trial in 2000, the details of the consumption were laid bare for the public record. Alexander believed that by consuming the flesh of the innocent, he was gaining a form of spiritual immortality that would protect him from the decay of the world. He kept a series of journals where he recorded his thoughts, which read like the ramblings of a fractured mind lost in a world of gore. The court heard how he would force captives to watch the process. The legal team struggled with the insanity defense, as Spasivtsev had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier, but had been released back into the population due to a lack of space in psychiatric wards. This revelation sparked a national debate about the state of healthcare in Russia. The people were outraged that a known threat had been allowed to return to a public housing unit where he could hunt without any oversight from the provincial authorities. Ludmila was also scrutinized for her role as the gatekeeper of this chamber of horrors. She claimed she acted out of fear of her son, but the evidence suggested a much more active participation in the selection of the targets. She would often clean the floor with the same towels she used for the laundry, blending the domestic and the demonic until the lines were completely blurred. Her cold demeanor during the sentencing haunted the jury members for a long time. As the cleanup of the apartment concluded in late 2000, the unit was sealed shut with heavy boards. But the memory of what happened there remained a permanent stain on the history of Novokuznetsk. The city would always be associated with the cannibal of the Urals, a reminder of how easily a monster can hide in the mundane settings of a modern city. The forensic evidence was so overwhelming that it became a case study for global criminology students. The echoes of those screams in the Siberian pipes eventually faded, but the sense of unease moved southward, across continents, to the coastal regions of South America. While the Russian tragedy was contained within the walls of a high-rise, a new terror was emerging under the open sky of Uruguay. There, on the moonlit stretches of the Atlantic shoreline, a figure was moving through the sand, waiting for the perfect moment to shatter the peace of the dunes. The coast of Uruguay is a place of breathtaking beauty, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against wide, sandy stretches known as the Ramblas. In the year 2000, the department of Canelones was a favorite destination for couples looking for a bit of privacy under the vast, starlit sky. They would drive their vehicles onto the secluded dunes, turn off the ignition, and listen to the rhythmic pulse of the tide. It was a culture of romance and tranquility. But as the new millennium dawned, that peace was shattered by a presence that the locals began to call the monster of the dunes. This was not a ghost or a legend, but a very real, very lethal individual who utilized the cover of the tall beach grass and the roar of the surf to mask his approach. He didn't want money, and he didn't want the cars. He wanted to destroy the very idea of safety that these young people felt in their most private moments. The pattern was terrifyingly consistent. A man and a woman would be sitting in their parked car, perhaps talking or watching the moon reflect off the water. Suddenly, a figure would materialize from the blackness of the dunes, appearing as if he had risen directly out of the sand. He was usually described as wearing dark, practical clothing and carrying a small caliber firearm. He would approach the driver's side window before the occupants even realized they were being watched. Without a word, the monster would fire through the glass, almost always targeting the male first to eliminate any potential resistance. The sound of the gunshot would be swallowed by the wind and the waves, leaving the female passenger trapped in a metal box with a dying companion and a cold-blooded killer standing just inches away. These were not quick robberies. They were prolonged, terrifying ordeals that often involved the abduction of the surviving woman. In 2000, the frequency of these attacks reached a fever pitch, turning the scenic coastal roads into a gauntlet of fear. The local authorities in Canelones were overwhelmed. The terrain was a nightmare for a forensic team. The shifting sands and the salt spray destroyed any fingerprints or footprints within minutes. There were no surveillance cameras in these remote areas, and the witnesses who survived were often too traumatized to provide a clear description. The investigation in 2000 focused on the idea that the killer was someone who knew the topography of the coast intimately. He knew which dunes offered the best vantage points and which escape routes were invisible to the occasional police cruiser. He moved with the confidence of a predator in his own backyard. This led to a wave of paranoia among the residents of the quiet seaside towns, who began to look at their own neighbors with a new sense of suspicion. As the summer months of 2000 progressed, the romance culture of Uruguay underwent a permanent shift. The Ramblas, once filled with the glow of distant headlights and the sounds of laughter, became a ghost coast. People stopped parking by the shore after sunset. The government was forced to increase patrols significantly, but the monster seemed to anticipate every move they made. He was a shadow that could not be caught, a phantom of the shoreline. The psychological impact on the community was profound. The idea that a person could be hunted while doing something as innocent as sitting by the ocean was a difficult reality for the public to process. The media coverage of the 2000 investigation was relentless, with every new lead being scrutinized by a terrified population. Yet, despite the massive police presence and the rewards offered for information, the monster remained an enigma in the darkness. What made the case particularly chilling was the lack of a clear motive beyond the infliction of suffering. The killer didn't leave notes, and he didn't make demands. He simply appeared, destroyed lives, and vanished back into the dunes. This lack of communication made him feel more like a force of nature than a human being. The people of Uruguay were left wondering if the next moonlit night would bring another headline of tragedy and another empty car on the sand. By the end of 2000, the intensity of the attacks began to wane, but the damage was already done. The mystery of the monster of the dunes remained one of the most significant unsolved chapters in the region's history. It changed the way people interacted with the landscape, proving that even the most beautiful places can hide a jagged edge. The case remains a cold reminder of the vulnerability of those who think they are alone in the wilderness. While the monster was stalking the quiet beaches of South America, a much larger and more organized kind of darkness was gathering in the heart of East Africa. In the hills of Uganda, thousands of people were surrendering their lives and their fortunes to a group of leaders who promised them salvation in the new millennium. But as the year 2000 arrived, those promises of heaven were about to be replaced by the literal flames of a living hell. In the lush, undulating hills of southwestern Uganda, there is a remote district known as Kanungu. It is a place where the green of the tropical vegetation is so vibrant it almost looks painted against the heavens. In the final years of the 20th century, this valley became the focal point for a religious movement that promised its followers a way to escape the impending demise of a world they believed was rotting from within. It was a time of extreme spiritual fervor. The group was called the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. It was led by a former tavern owner named Credonia Morindi and a defrocked priest named Joseph Kibwetere. Together, they convinced thousands of rural farmers and former teachers to sell their ancestral possessions, leave their kin, and move to a communal plantation. They claimed that the Virgin Mary was providing a roadmap for the coming apocalypse in the year 2000. Credonia was a woman of immense charisma who dictated every aspect of the disciples' existence. She enforced a rule of silence, requiring her devotees to use complex hand signals to communicate under the guise of preventing sinful speech. This created an environment of total isolation and psychological dependence. The followers were told that the world would expire on the final stroke of midnight on December 31st, 1999. They waited in prayer. When the sun rose on January 1st, 2000, and the world was still intact, a wave of confusion swept through the settlement. People had surrendered their life savings and their lands to the movement. Now, they were standing in a field with nothing, facing a prophecy that had failed to materialize. The shepherds, sensing the growing resentment and the demands for the return of their wealth, quickly pivoted their narrative to buy themselves some more time. They announced that the Virgin Mary had granted a short extension of mercy to allow more souls to be saved. The new date for the translation to heaven was set for March 17, 2000. To prepare for this final event, the members were instructed to gather at the main sanctuary in Kanungu for a week of purification. There was a strange energy in the air, a mixture of desperate hope and a flickering suspicion that something was fundamentally wrong. The disciples were moved to a location they called the Gateway to Heaven. It was a self-sustaining farm where the members worked from dawn until dusk under the scorching equatorial sun. They grew their own vegetables and raised livestock, but they were rarely allowed to eat the fruits of their labor. Most of the produce was sold in the local markets to fund the leaders' lavish lifestyles, while the workers lived on a meager diet of thin porridge and water. The enforcement of silence was a masterstroke of control. By prohibiting speech, Credonia ensured that the followers could not share their doubts or organize any form of resistance. If someone felt a flicker of skepticism, they had no way to vocalize it to their peers. This created a profound sense of loneliness within a crowd, a psychological vacuum that could only be filled by the teachings of the shepherds. They were effectively trapped in a world of silence. As the final hours of 1999 approached, the settlement was thick with anticipation. The members had cleaned their simple huts and put on their best clothing, believing that they would be physically lifted from the ground and transported to a celestial realm. When the clocks rolled over to the year 2000 and the stars remained in their fixed positions, the silence of the camp was replaced by a low, mournful humming. It was a dream dying. To prevent a full-scale revolt, Credonia claimed she had received a new vision. She told the masses that their faith had been tested, and because a few members still harbored impure thoughts, the entire group had been delayed. This shifted the blame from the leaders to the victims themselves, creating a culture of mutual suspicion and guilt. Everyone began to watch their neighbors for signs of sin, further cementing the power of the two individuals at the top. The decision to finalize the group was likely made in February of 2000. The leaders realized that they could not keep the facade going forever, especially as local creditors began to inquire about the movement's mounting debts. They began to stockpile large quantities of petrol and sulfuric acid, which they claimed were needed for cleansing rituals and construction projects. In reality, they were gathering the fuel for a massive final act of erasure. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the followers were treated to a rare feast. They were given soda and roasted meat, luxuries they had not tasted in years of ascetic living. They were also told to write letters to their relatives, saying goodbye and explaining that they were going to a better place. To the outside observer, it looked like a peaceful, albeit strange, religious gathering. But behind the scenes, the shepherds were preparing a very different end. The followers were instructed to settle all their earthly affairs. They were told to write to their families in distant villages, informing them that the restoration was complete and that they were moving to a secret location to await the final call. These letters served two purposes. First, they provided a sense of closure. Second, they ensured that no one would come looking for the disciples for several weeks, giving the leaders a significant head start to flee. On the morning of the 17th, over 500 individuals filed into the sturdy clay block tabernacle. They wore their finest ceremonial robes, mostly white and green, representing purity and new life. Once everyone was inside, the portals were nailed shut from the exterior with heavy timber. The main entryways were locked and barred, turning the house of worship into a massive, airtight container. The devotees likely believed this was part of the ritual. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the valley, followed by a roar of flame that reached higher than the surrounding trees. The roof of the building collapsed inward, and the interior became a swirling vortex of heat and chemical fumes. Those standing outside in the village watched in horror as the structure was consumed in a matter of minutes. The sound of the inferno was so loud that it drowned out the voices of those trapped, creating a wall of sound. Initially, the global press reported the event as a tragic mass suicide. However, when the lawmen from the capital arrived to sift through the charcoal and ash, they discovered a much more sinister reality. They found that many of the fallen had not died from smoke inhalation or burns. Instead, there were clear signs of trauma that occurred before the blaze began. Some had been strangled with cords or wire. Others had wounds consistent with sharp blades. When the first responders entered the smoldering ruins of the sanctuary, they were struck by the physical evidence of a struggle. Near the boarded openings, they found claw marks in the clay, suggesting that as the heat intensified, the victims had tried desperately to escape their wooden trap. The presence of sulfuric acid meant that the air had turned into a caustic fog that melted the lungs of anyone who took a breath, making the end a suffocating process. The investigation then moved to the other properties, such as a site in Buziga and another in Rugazi. At these secondary locations, the horror was even more clinical. Teams of diggers uncovered mass burial pits beneath the floors of several houses. These victims had been slaughtered months earlier, during the period when the prophecy had first failed. It became evident that the leaders were thinning the herd, removing anyone who showed even a hint of rebellion. In total, the count of the deceased rose to over 780 people. It was a staggering figure that made it one of the largest cult-related tragedies in human memory. The prophecy had been a cover for a massive financial scam, and when the scam was threatened by the dawn of the year 2000, the leaders chose to kill the witnesses. The movement was a perfectly executed long con that utilized the religious anxiety of the new millennium. The financial records that were later recovered showed that millions of shillings had been transferred to private accounts shortly before the March 17th massacre. The fire was simply the final cleanup. The tragedy stands as a stark warning about the intersection of predatory greed and extreme spiritual longing. The Valley of Kanungu was left with a scar that would never heal. The families of the fallen were left with a profound sense of loss and skepticism. The most frustrating part of the inquiry was the total disappearance of Credonia and Joseph. While their remains were expected to be found among the wreckage, there was no forensic proof that they had actually been inside during the explosion. Witnesses reported seeing a vehicle leaving the compound shortly before the smoke appeared. It is widely believed that they fled across the border with the group's assets, leaving their faithful disciples to perish in the heat. The site of the fire eventually became a place of pilgrimage, but not for the reasons the cult intended. It stood as a monument to the dangers of blind faith and the capacity for human greed to mask itself behind the language of spiritual restoration. This event sent shockwaves through the continent, leading to a massive crackdown on unregulated religious organizations. It proved that the transition into the new millennium was a period of profound vulnerability. The silence that followed the fire was a heavy, suffocating thing that reminded everyone of the high cost of a misplaced belief. As the smoke finally cleared over the hills of Uganda, the world turned its attention back to the historic corridors of Europe. While the tragedy in Africa was defined by fire and a public display of devotion, a different kind of shadow was haunting the rock parishes of Italy, where a figure in a dark robe was moving through the stone. The cobblestone streets of Prato, Italy, are saturated with a history that stretches back over 1,000 years. In this corner of Tuscany, the architecture is a testament to a time when life revolved around the rhythm of the cathedral bells and the sanctity of the parish. The limestone walls of the medieval center are narrow and steep, creating a world of deep shadows even during the brightest hours of the afternoon. It is a place where the past feels very present. In the year 2000, a strange and terrifying phenomenon began to unfold within these ancient corridors. It started with the elderly parishioners who gathered for early morning vespers or stayed late into the evening for private prayer. These were people who had lived in the shadow of the great churches for their entire lives, finding comfort in the scent of incense and the cool touch of the smooth stone. But suddenly, their place of refuge became a hunting ground. The first reports were whispered among the pews of the San Stefano Cathedral. An elderly woman, walking home through a mist-covered piazza, claimed she had been followed by a figure wearing a long, dark cowl that completely obscured their face. The figure didn't speak or approach her directly, it simply moved in perfect silence, staying exactly 10 paces behind her until she reached her heavy wooden door. She described the presence as something ancient and cold. Soon, the encounters turned from unsettling observations into brutal physical assaults. In the spring of 2000, a local sacristan was found slumped against the base of a fountain, suffering from wounds that appeared to have been inflicted with a heavy, blunt object. He told the investigators that a man in a black monk's robe had stepped out from behind a column and attacked him without warning. The assailant did not take his wallet or his keys. The panic in Prato began to intensify as more residents reported seeing the hooded entity lurking near the entrances of the smaller chapels and the historic cloisters. The local media dubbed the predator the Black Monk, and the name alone was enough to keep people indoors after the sun dipped below the Tuscan hills. There was a sense that the new millennium had awakened a dormant evil, something that belonged to the era of the Inquisition rather than the modern age. The authorities were dealing with a very specific kind of terror. Unlike the gangs of the cities or the highway pirates of the Pampa, this individual seemed to be motivated by a distorted religious fervor. The victims were always targeted near places of worship, and the timing of the attacks often coincided with significant dates in the liturgical calendar. It felt as though someone was performing a perverted version of a ritual, using the streets as their stage. During the summer of 2000, the atmosphere in the diocese was one of total siege. The priests began to lock the side doors of the cathedrals, and the elderly were escorted to their homes by groups of younger volunteers. The police increased their presence in the medieval center, but the narrow, winding nature of the alleys made it easy for someone who knew the terrain to vanish into the limestone crevices. The Black Monk was becoming a modern ghost. The breakthrough in the investigation came during a humid night in September. A local priest was closing the heavy bronze doors of his parish when he felt a sudden draft behind him. He turned to find a man dressed in a heavy, dark garment that looked like a homemade monastic habit. The man was holding a heavy wooden crucifix that had been sharpened into a jagged point. He was muttering phrases in a fractured Latin, his eyes wide with a terrifying intensity. The priest, showing remarkable composure, managed to push the heavy door shut and bolt it just as the assailant lunged forward. The sound of the sharpened wood splintering against the bronze echoed through the quiet square, alerting a nearby police patrol. The officers arrived to find the man trying to scale the side of the rectory wall. After a brief struggle in the dirt and the shadows, the figure was finally subdued and taken into custody for questioning. When the hood was pulled back at the station, the investigators didn't find a demon or a medieval specter. Instead, they found a 32-year-old drifter who had been suffering from severe psychological distress exacerbated by the arrival of the new millennium. He had become convinced that he was a divine messenger tasked with purifying the church of its perceived sins. He believed that by attacking the faithful, he was forcing them into a state of penance. The search of the man's temporary residence revealed a series of disturbing artifacts. He had covered the walls in charcoal drawings of apocalyptic scenes and had written thousands of pages of ramblings about the end of the world. He viewed the transition to the year 2000 as a cosmic gateway that required blood to remain open. The case highlighted a very specific phenomenon known as millennial fever, where vulnerable individuals lost their grip on reality. The trial of the Black Monk in late 2000 was a somber affair. The court heard testimony from the elderly victims, who still felt the phantom weight of the cowl following them through the streets. The defense argued that the man was a product of a system that failed to provide adequate mental health support during a time of global anxiety. Ultimately, he was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility, and the robes were placed into evidence logs. The city of Prato slowly returned to its quiet rhythms, but the memory of the hooded figure in the shadows remained a part of the local lore. The limestone walls still held the secrets of the year 2000, a reminder that the most ancient fears can find new life in the modern world. The sense of sanctity was restored, but the parishioners would always look twice at the dark corners of the cloisters before they kneeled to offer their prayers to the heavens. While the terror in Italy was defined by religious delusions and the aesthetic of the past, on the other side of the globe, a different kind of psychological horror was coming to light. In the desert landscape of New Mexico, the year 2000 would bring the release of evidence so harrowing it would redefine the public's understanding of human cruelty. The focus would shift from the stone corridors of Tuscany to a soundproofed trailer filled with the tools of a nightmare. Near the shimmering waters of Elephant Butte Reservoir in the arid expanse of New Mexico, the landscape is defined by its harsh sun and the vast, open silence of the scrubland. In the year 2000, this silence was replaced by the frantic activity of federal agents who were meticulously combing through a property that seemed ordinary from the outside. But inside a nondescript white trailer, they had discovered a mechanical heart of absolute darkness. David Parker Ray was a man who worked for the State Park Service, a person who understood the mechanics of things and the isolation of the desert. He was someone your neighbors might invite over for a barbecue, a quiet individual who seemed to enjoy his hobbies. But in the year 2000, the world learned that his hobby was the systematic destruction of the human spirit inside a soundproofed chamber he had spent decades refining and perfecting. While the initial arrest had occurred a year earlier, the year 2000 was the moment when the seal on the investigation was broken and the true scale of the horror was released to the public. The agents had spent months processing the contents of the trailer, which Ray had nicknamed the Toy Box. It was a space that had been engineered with over $100,000 worth of surgical equipment, electrical devices, and elaborate restraints. The atmosphere inside the trailer was clinical and sterile, which made the purpose of the tools even more distressing. There were gynecological tables, dental tools, and a series of monitors that allowed Ray to record every moment of his victim's agony. In the year 2000, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began the arduous task of cataloging these recordings, which amounted to hundreds of hours of footage that most people could not watch for long. What set this case apart was the psychological warfare Ray employed. He didn't just want to hurt people, he wanted to erase their identities. When a victim first woke up in the trailer, they were forced to listen to a pre-recorded audio tape that lasted for over an hour. This tape, which became widely known in 2000, was a calm, monotone narration by Ray where he explained exactly what was going to happen to them and why they would never be found. The transcript of this recording was so harrowing that it was used in court as a primary piece of evidence. Ray's voice on the tape was chillingly polite, as if he were giving a safety briefing on a flight rather than describing a descent into hell. He told his captives that their previous lives were over and that they now existed only for his entertainment. This methodical approach to depravity was something the investigators had never encountered before. In the year 2000, the focus of the task force shifted to the identification of the women seen in Ray's extensive library of videos. He had kept a meticulous victim log that suggested he had targeted upwards of 60 people over several decades. Many of these women were transients or individuals who might not be missed immediately, but others were people who had simply vanished from their daily lives without a single trace left behind for the family. The FBI began a nationwide effort to match the faces in the videos to missing persons reports from across the country. This was a race against time, as many of the women had been drugged with a cocktail of chemicals that caused temporary amnesia. Ray would often release his victims near bus stations or in remote areas after their ordeal was over, betting on the fact that they would have no clear memory of where they had been or who had held them captive. This realization meant that there were dozens of women living their lives in the year 2000 who had no idea they were survivors of one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. The agents had to navigate a minefield of ethical and psychological challenges as they contacted potential survivors. They were effectively handing these women a memory of a nightmare they had suppressed, forcing them to relive a trauma that was buried deep. The trial proceedings in 2000 were so intense that the court had to provide specialized counseling for the jurors. Many of them were unable to sleep after hearing the audio tapes and seeing the photographs of the equipment. The defense tried to argue that Ray was merely a fetishist who had gone too far, but the sheer volume of evidence and the testimonies of the few women who did remember their time in the toy box painted a much more lethal picture. One of the most disturbing revelations of the year 2000 was the involvement of Ray's daughter and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy. They had acted as accomplices, helping him lure victims and even participating in the sessions inside the trailer. This familial aspect of the crimes suggested a level of normalization that was hard for the public to grasp. The idea that a family could sit down for dinner and then head to a trailer to commit atrocities was mind-bending. As the year 2000 drew to a close, the toy box was dismantled piece by piece, but the shadows it cast over the New Mexico desert remained. The investigation continued to uncover links to unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s, suggesting that Ray had been active for far longer than anyone had realized. He was a predator who had utilized the emptiness of the American West to hide a factory of pain that operated in total, eerie silence. The discovery of the victim log was the final nail in the coffin of Ray's public image. It proved that he was not a man who had made a mistake, but a hunter who viewed other human beings as nothing more than biological parts to be manipulated. The case became a landmark in the study of sadistic personality disorders, providing a rare and terrifying look into the mind of someone who had completely detached themselves from the concepts of empathy and remorse. The desert sun continued to bake the earth around Elephant Butte, but the silence of the landscape now felt heavy with the weight of the names in that log. The people of New Mexico were left to wonder how many other trailers were parked in the vastness of the scrubland, hidden by the horizon and the apathy of the world. It was a chapter of American crime that would never truly be closed, as many of the women in the videos were never positively identified. While the revelations in New Mexico were defined by a technical, soundproofed isolation across the Pacific, a different kind of quiet was descending on the island of Miyake-jima. There, it wasn't a man-made chamber that was silencing the world, but the primal force of the earth itself. As a volcanic eruption forced an entire population to flee, the empty streets of the island became a playground for a very different and very organized kind of predator. The Pacific Ocean is home to many secrets, but few are as volatile as the volcanic islands that dot the coast of Japan. In the year 2000, the residents of Miyake-jima, a small island located approximately 180 kilometers south of Tokyo, were living a life dictated by the rhythms of the sea and the towering presence of Mount Oyama. This peak was more than just a landmark. It was the sleeping giant that sat at the very heart of their tiny world. Life on this island was peaceful and traditional, with a population of nearly 4,000 people who relied on fishing and tourism. They were used to the occasional tremor, as Japan is one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. But in June of 2000, the ground began to shake with a frequency that suggested something much more significant was happening beneath the surface. The tremors were constant, shaking the foundations of every house. By July, Mount Oyama had officially awoken, sending massive plumes of ash and steam high into the atmosphere. The sky over Miyake-jima turned a sickly shade of gray as the volcanic debris began to fall like a heavy, suffocating snow. It coated the roofs, the gardens, and the docks in a thick layer of fine powder that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. The residents began to realize that their home was becoming a very dangerous place. The most terrifying aspect of the eruption was not the ash, but the invisible threat of sulfur dioxide gas that began to leak from the vents in the earth. The concentrations of the gas reached levels that were lethal to humans and animals alike. The government issued a mandatory requirement for everyone on the island to carry a gas mask at all times. The sight of school children playing in masks became a haunting symbol of the struggle for survival in 2000. In September of 2000, the situation became untenable. The volcanic activity was increasing, and the risk of a massive, catastrophic explosion was looming. The Japanese authorities issued an emergency order for the total evacuation of the island. Every single inhabitant had to pack their most essential belongings into small bags and make their way to the harbor. They were leaving behind their houses, their businesses, and the lives they had built over decades. The evacuation was a logistical feat of precision and heartbreak. Families stood in long lines on the docks, watching the ash settle on their abandoned cars and the small shrines that guarded their doorways. Many had to leave behind their pets, promising they would return soon, though no one knew when the air would be safe again. By the end of the month, the island was a ghost town, an empty rock in the middle of the sea, guarded only by the Coast Guard. Miyake-jima was now a restricted zone, a place where no human was allowed to step without high-level clearance and heavy protective gear. The empty streets were silent, save for the sound of the wind blowing through the ash and the occasional rumble of the mountain. It was a landscape of desolation, but to a specific group of people on the mainland, this abandoned island represented a unique and lucrative opportunity for a high-stakes criminal enterprise. The Yakuza, Japan's notorious organized crime syndicates, have a long history of finding ways to profit from the misfortunes of others. In the late months of 2000, several high-ranking members of a Tokyo-based crew saw the evacuation of Miyake-jima not as a tragedy, but as a giant, unguarded vault. They knew that thousands of homes and businesses were sitting completely empty, filled with family heirlooms, cash, and high-value consumer goods. They also knew that the Coast Guard was focused on monitoring the volcanic activity and keeping unauthorized civilian vessels away from the danger zone. The Yakuza began to plan a series of maritime incursions utilizing small, fast boats that could slip through the radar coverage under the cover of the heavy sea mist. They were prepared to risk the toxic gases and the unpredictable eruptions for the chance to strip the island of its remaining wealth. The looters were not common thieves. They were organized and tactical. They arrived on the island at midnight, wearing high-grade respirators and carrying specialized tools to bypass the locks on the abandoned structures. They moved through the ash-covered neighborhoods like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the volcanic dust. They didn't target every house, but instead focused on the residences of the island's wealthiest families and the local businesses. As they entered the abandoned dwellings, they found scenes frozen in time. Half-finished meals sat on kitchen tables, and family photos were still displayed on the mantels. The looters showed no respect for the sanctity of these spaces. They tore through drawers, smashed open personal safes, and gathered up gold jewelry in stacks of yen. They even took expensive electronics and rare antiques, hauling the heavy loads back to their vessels at the harbor. The desecration of the island was systematic. The Yakuza returned multiple times over the course of the late autumn of 2000, growing bolder with each successful trip. They treated the entire municipality as their personal warehouse. The ash actually helped them, as it dampened the sound of their activities and made it harder for any distant observers to see the light of their flashlights. They felt invincible in the toxic silence of the restricted zone. However, the Japanese Coast Guard began to notice unusual patterns in the maritime traffic around the perimeter. They detected small radar blips that appeared and disappeared near the island's rocky coves. They realized that someone was braving the sulfur clouds to gain access to the ghost town. In late 2000, a high-speed chase occurred on the high seas as the authorities moved to intercept a suspicious boat, leaving the Miyake-jima harbor area. When the officers boarded the vessel, they were shocked by what they found. The hold was overflowing with household items, from televisions to boxes of traditional wedding garments and family heirlooms. The men on board were identified as members of a known crime syndicate, and they were still wearing their gas masks. This discovery of disaster opportunism sent a wave of outrage through Japan, a country that prides itself on its social order and respect. The news that criminals were looting the homes of people who had lost everything to a natural disaster was a profound shock to the public consciousness. It revealed a predatory side of the underworld that was willing to gamble with their own lives in a volcanic wasteland for the sake of greed. The authorities were forced to divert even more resources to guarding the empty island, creating a permanent maritime blockade that lasted for the next 5 years. The residents of Miyake-jima, living in temporary housing on the mainland, were devastated to learn that their abandoned sanctuary had been violated. For them, the volcano was a force of nature they respected, but the looters were a force of human malice that was much harder to accept. The story of the island's evacuation became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of societies when the structures of everyday life are suddenly and violently removed. As the ash continued to fall on the empty streets of Japan, a world away in the quiet valleys of Switzerland, another kind of violation was taking place. While the Yakuza were hunting for gold and cash in a volcanic ghost town, a lone individual was moving through the moonlit cemeteries of the Alps. He wasn't interested in the wealth of the living. He was searching for a very specific and much more disturbing kind of treasure hidden beneath the soil. High up in the Swiss Alps, within the jagged peaks of the Valais Canton, there is a stillness that feels heavier than the mountain air itself. By the time the year 2000 arrived, the residents of the small villages were used to the biting cold and the isolation of the high valleys. They took great pride in their ancestral heritage and the sacred nature of their resting places, which were often carved directly into the slopes of the granite mountains. The cemeteries in this region are not just burial grounds. They are meticulously maintained gardens of the departed, where every headstone is a piece of art and every plot is decorated with fresh flowers. To the local population, these sites represent a bridge between the past and the future. But in the late months of '99 and the start of 2000, a series of deeply disturbing occurrences began to violate the tranquility of these mountain sanctuaries. It started with a local groundskeeper who noticed that the soil over a recent interment had been disturbed in a way that did not look like the work of a wild animal. There were no claw marks or signs of scavenging. Instead, it looked as if someone had used a narrow spade to carefully lift the top layer of sod. Initially, the staff thought it might be a prank or perhaps a dispute between families, but then they discovered the physical evidence of a deeper intrusion. As the spring of 2000 warmed the valley, more reports began to surface from different villages throughout the Valais region. In one instance, a heavy stone lid of a mausoleum had been slid aside just enough for a slender individual to squeeze through the gap. Inside, the caskets were not just searched for jewelry or valuables, they were opened with a surgical precision that suggested the intruder was not interested in gold, but in the contents themselves. The local gendarmes were initially hesitant to share the details of these crimes with the public, fearing a wave of mass hysteria. They were dealing with a level of necrophilic behavior that was unprecedented in the peaceful history of the Alps. The intruder, whom the press later dubbed the Vampire of Valais, seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the local obituary listings. He knew exactly which sites were occupied by females who had recently passed away. The psychological impact on the grieving families was devastating. The idea that their loved ones were being targeted after they had been laid to rest was an agony that surpassed the initial loss. The people of the canton began to organize their own nocturnal vigils, carrying lanterns and heavy staves as they walked the perimeters of the graveyards. The mountain air, usually so fresh and crisp, now felt thick with the weight of a hidden and ritualistic evil. In the summer of 2000, a 34-year-old local resident was finally apprehended after he was spotted jumping a low stone fence in the middle of a moonlit evening. When the gendarmes searched his vehicle, they found a collection of tools that were caked in dry soil and carried the unmistakable odor of the underground. He was a quiet, unassuming man who worked a regular job, which made his nocturnal activities even more difficult to comprehend. During the subsequent interrogation, the man did not show remorse or fear. Instead, he spoke with a clinical detachment about his need to be near the deceased. He viewed the cemeteries as his personal library of history, and the acts he performed were described in a way that suggested a deep internal delusion. The investigators realized they were not dealing with a thief, but with someone who had completely detached from the social norms of the living world. The legal proceedings that took place in late 2000 became a landmark event for the Swiss judiciary. The prosecutors struggled to find a specific statute that adequately covered the horror of the crimes. In Switzerland at that time, there was no clear law specifically targeting the act of necrophilia. The defense argued that because the subjects of his actions were no longer living, there was technically no victim to testify to the harm that was done. This legal loophole created a firestorm of controversy. The court had to decide if the crime should be classified as simple property damage or something much more profound. The public was outraged at the suggestion that the desecration of human remains could be treated with the same weight as a broken window or a stolen bicycle. The judges realized that the existing legal framework was woefully unprepared for a predator who hunted within the realm of the dead. Throughout the trial in 2000, the expert witnesses provided testimony about the long-term psychological effects on the surviving relatives. They argued that the violation of the peace of the dead was a direct assault on the mental health of the entire community. This argument eventually led to a total overhaul of the National Penal Code, creating new and severe penalties for the desecration of corpses and the violation of burial sites in the nation. The sentencing of the 34-year-old was a somber moment that brought a sense of closure to the Valais region, but the scars remained. The man was committed to a secure facility where he would receive intensive psychiatric treatment. The cemeteries were fitted with new security systems, including motion sensors and reinforced gates. The tradition of the open, welcoming mountain graveyard had been permanently altered by the actions of a single individual. As the year 2000 came to a close, the Swiss villages slowly returned to their quiet routines, but the memory of the vampire remained a chilling part of their local history. People still visit the graves of their ancestors, but they do so with a new awareness of the fragility of the peace they once took for granted. The granite peaks of the Alps still stand watch over the valleys, hiding the secrets of those who move in the shades of the midnight orb. The sense of violation in the high Alps was a singular, intimate horror that haunted the families of Valais. But as the Millennium continued to unfold, a different kind of phantom was appearing on the vast ribbons of pavement in the American South. Thousands of miles away from the quiet Swiss tombs, the focus shifted back to the long, lonely stretches of the interstate, where a killer was using the constant motion of the highway to mask a series of strangulations. Traveling along the southern corridors of the United States in the year 2000, women were beginning to realize that the convenience of the rest stop was becoming a gamble with their lives. The vastness of the American highway system provided a different kind of anonymity than the mountain valleys of Europe. Here, the predator was not digging into the earth. He was watching the traffic, waiting for a lone traveler to step out of the light and into his path. The investigation into the interstate strangler would eventually span multiple states, but it began with the discovery of a specific signature that left investigators baffled. It was a detail that seemed small, almost trivial, until the bodies began to pile up in the tall grass near the off-ramps. The missing footwear of the victims was the first clue that they were dealing with someone who was not just a killer, but a collector of memories from the pavement. The atmosphere of the truck stops and roadside diners in the year 2000 was one of guarded caution. The camaraderie of the road was being replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of suspicion. Every set of headlights in the rearview mirror was a potential threat, and every conversation at a gas pump was a test of character. The American interstate was no longer just a way to get from one place to another, it had become a hunting ground for a phantom. In the rural districts of China, a farmer would soon make a discovery that would expose an even broader network of human suffering. While the American highway killer focused on the individual, the discovery in the Shandong province would reveal a systematic operation that treated human beings as commodities. The year 2000 would prove to be a global period of revelation, where the hidden wells and the quiet graves would finally give up their secrets. The transition into the new century was supposed to be a time of progress and light, but for many, it was a year of profound and terrifying realizations. From the snowy peaks of Switzerland to the dusty roads of Shandong, the truth was beginning to surface. The investigators of the world were working in parallel, trying to piece together the fragments of lives that had been shattered by individuals who operated in the gaps of the modern security systems. Whether it was the Yakuza in Japan or a lonely drifter in New Mexico, the year 2000 was a testament to the capacity for human malice to adapt to any environment. The stories of those who survived and those who did not would become the foundation for a new understanding of criminal behavior. As the final chapters of the year were written, the world was left with a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we never see coming. The silence of the Valais cemeteries was eventually restored, but the legal precedent set during the trial would influence international law for decades. It was a victory for the dignity of the deceased and a recognition that the impact of a crime does not end when a heart stops beating. The families could finally rest, knowing that the peace of their loved ones was protected by more than just the mountain stone, but by the weight of the law itself. The echoes of the year 2000 continue to resonate today, providing a roadmap for those who seek to understand the darker corners of human nature. Each case, from the highway pirates of Argentina to the cannibal of the Urals, offers a glimpse into a world that most of us will never experience. It is a world of shadows and secrets, where the ordinary is often a mask for the extraordinary, and where the truth is often stranger than any fiction. As we look back on these 12 months of tragedy and triumph, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of vigilance. The stories of the year 2000 are not just records of crime. They are accounts of the communities that refused to be broken and the individuals who dedicated their lives to finding justice in a world that often seemed to have forgotten its meaning. The night is long, but the light of the truth always finds a way. Descending from the crisp elevations of the European peaks, we move into a region defined by a heavy, liquid atmosphere that clings to the skin like a wet shroud. In the year 2000, the transit corridor known as Interstate 55, which slices through the heart of the Magnolia State and down into the Pelican State, became a landscape of profound anxiety. This stretch of blacktop is surrounded by thick pine forests and deep, murky basins where the vegetation is tangled and wild. The climate in this southern territory during the summer of 2000 was a physical weight, a mixture of extreme heat and a humidity that made the simple act of breathing feel like a chore. The air was thick with the scent of pine sap and the distant metallic tang of industrial exhaust from the massive rigs that rolled toward the Gulf Coast. It was a world of constant motion, where thousands of travelers navigated the thoroughfare, stopping only for fuel or a brief rest. For the female travelers and the workers at the lonely service plazas along this route, the transit was no longer a routine journey. A presence was moving through the shadows of the fuel pumps and the dimly lit vending areas. A predator who looked for the solitary and the distracted. This was not an impulsive slayer. He was a methodical hunter who utilized the constant noise of the heavy engines to mask a series of swift and silent abductions that left the local towns reeling. It began in the early months of the new millennium when a maintenance crew, working near a deep culvert outside of Jackson, discovered a sight that froze them in their tracks. Tucked away in the tall, yellow grass of a drainage basin were the remains of a young woman. She had not been there long, but the elements of the delta were already beginning to reclaim her. The initial examination revealed a terrifying lack of struggle, suggesting the end had come with surgical speed. When the local marshals and deputies arrived at the scene, they noted a detail that seemed insignificant at first, but would soon become the primary signature of a serial offender. The target was fully clothed, her jewelry still intact, but her feet were completely bare. Her shoes, which would have been essential for walking through the rough terrain of the roadside, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the slayer had taken them as a prize to keep for his own private collection. By the middle of 2000, the pattern repeated itself 50 miles to the south, near the border of the Louisiana marshlands. Another female was located in a swampy thicket, her life extinguished by the same brutal application of pressure to the throat. Again, the investigators found her without any footwear. The absence of the heels or the sneakers became a chilling hallmark that suggested a specific fetish was driving the violence on the interstate thoroughfare. The fear among the public began to manifest as a visible change in behavior at the rest stops. Women no longer walked alone to the restrooms, and the vibrant chatter of the roadside diners was replaced by a wary silence. Every man sitting in a sedan or a hauler was viewed with intense suspicion. The troopers increased their patrols, but the expanse of the 55 was too vast to monitor every mile. The slayer seemed to move with the vapor, appearing and vanishing. The investigation in 2000 required a level of cooperation between the Magnolia and Pelican states that was unprecedented for the local law enforcement. They formed a specialized task force dedicated to the I-55 corridor, sharing forensic data and witness statements across state lines. They realized they were looking for someone who likely spent a significant amount of time behind the wheel, perhaps a professional operator who knew the blind spots of the plazas. The psychological profile of the Phantom of the 55 suggested a man who found power in the act of silencing his targets. The manual strangulation was a deeply personal method of homicide, requiring him to be inches away from his prey as the light left their eyes. Taking the shoes was a way to extend the duration of the crime, allowing him to hold onto a physical piece of the trauma long after he had discarded the remains in a ditch or a muddy creek bed. As the summer transitioned into the autumn of 2000, the task force began to utilize undercover agents at the truck stops. These women were trained in self-defense and were equipped with hidden transmitters, acting as bait for a man who believed the highway was his personal pantry. The tension during these operations was palpable as the officers waited in the back of unmarked vans, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the tires on the pavement. The breakthrough remained elusive for months, as the perpetrator was careful to avoid any area with active surveillance. He chose the most desolate exits, where the trees crowded the shoulder and the light of the moon was blocked by the heavy canopy of the forest. He was a student of the geography, knowing exactly where the jurisdiction of one sheriff ended and the next began. This cat-and-mouse game continued until the very final weeks of the year 2000. While the southern states were grappling with this phantom of the asphalt, the global focus was shifting toward the east. The year 2000 was a period of uncovering the hidden, and while the marshals were searching the ditches of Mississippi, a simple farmer in the Shandong province of China was about to stumble upon a discovery that would expose a much larger and more industrial scale of human misery. The two cases were connected by a single dark thread. The stories of the year 2000 were proving that no matter the location, the capacity for cruelty remained a constant. The I-55 Strangler was a reminder of the vulnerability we face when we are in transit, moving between the safety of our homes and our destinations. It was a year where the simple act of stopping for gasoline could result in a total erasure of a person's existence. The fear was a living thing that followed the lines on the pavement. As the investigation in the South eventually led to a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight as a local delivery driver, the sense of relief was tempered by the knowledge of what had been lost. The footwear of the victims was never fully recovered, leaving a lingering question about where the slayer had hidden his gallery of trophies. The case was a milestone in multi-state coordination, proving that the law could be just as persistent as the shadows it hunted. The crickets in the Mississippi Delta continued their rhythmic song, but the thoroughfare was changed forever. The people who lived along the corridor would always remember the year 2000 as the time when the blacktop became a place of mourning. The humidity still hangs heavy over the bayous, but the marshals remain vigilant, watching the headlights as they flicker through the pine trees, ensuring that the phantoms of the past stay in the rearview mirror. Now, we must leave the muggy heat of the American South behind and travel across the globe to the rural heart of Asia. In a place where the earth is hard and the traditions are ancient, a discovery inside a forgotten irrigation well would soon reveal a conspiracy that reached far beyond the local village. It was a mystery that would challenge the authorities of a superpower and force a nation to confront the darkest aspects of its own shadow economy in the new century. The Shandong region in the eastern portion of the mainland is a territory defined by a profound loyalty to the crust of the planet and the ancient cycles of the grain cycle. In the year 2000, the rustic vista was a collage of golden stalks and tiny clusters of residences where every inhabitant understood the history of their peers. It was a location where physical labor was the primary way of life. But under the parched surface of this area, a mystery was waiting. On a notably parched morning in the spring of 2000, a local laborer named Lee was walking toward the boundary of his acreage. He was making his way to a vintage irrigation shaft that had been dormant for several rotations of the sun. The atmosphere was heavy with the aroma of dry vegetation and the sound of the breeze moving through the plants. He intended to verify if the subterranean moisture was adequate for the upcoming task of seeding the next cycle. As he reached the circular brickwork of the opening, he noticed a peculiar odor drifting from the cavity. It was not the typical damp aroma of a water source. It was something cloying and offensive, a scent that suggested a biological presence had perished within the hole. Lee leaned over the ledge, looking into the round void. At first, he observed only the reflection of the heavens, but as his vision adjusted, he saw a shred of colorful fabric snagged on the winch. He lowered a bucket on a rope, hoping to clear whatever obstruction was fouling the air. When he pulled the line back up, the weight felt significantly heavier than he expected. As the bucket reached the surface, Lee stumbled backward in a state of pure shock. Tangled within the iron handle was a long strand of human hair and a piece of silk that looked like part of a tunic. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His irrigation source had become a tomb. The Provincial Bureau magistrates arrived in the village shortly after noon, bringing a team of specialized excavators. They began the grueling process of clearing the debris from the bottom of the brick cylinder. As the buckets came up, one after another, the scale of the tragedy became undeniable. They did not find a single individual. By the end of the first day in 2000, the officials had recovered the skeletal traces of 4 different young females. The investigation in Shandong was handled with a level of intensity that reflected the gravity of the find. The detectives noted that the deceased were dressed in clothing that suggested they were from the inland provinces, far to the west of the coastal regions. They wore small tokens of jewelry and carried personal items that indicated they were in the middle of a journey when they reached their end. They had been discarded like refuse in the middle of a field. The magistrates soon uncovered a link between these 4 individuals and a series of missing persons reports from the mountain regions. It appeared that these women had been promised lucrative positions in a modern garment factory on the coast. They were told that they would be able to send large amounts of wealth back to their impoverished families. It was a lure designed to exploit their hope for a better life in the booming economy of the new millennium. However, the factory did not exist. The inquiry revealed that the victims had been intercepted by a sophisticated trafficking syndicate that operated in the shadows of the rural trade routes. These criminals were part of a dark market that treated human beings as a commodity, selling women as forced brides to men in remote villages who were unable to find wives through traditional means. It was a system of modern bondage that thrived on deception and isolation. The 4 females found in the well had likely resisted their captors or were deemed unsuitable for the trade. To ensure their silence, the syndicate had simply eliminated them and used the abandoned irrigation shaft as a convenient disposal site. This revelation sent a wave of fury through the national government in 2000. The idea that a criminal network was hunting the vulnerable within their own borders was an insult to the state's vision of social order. In response to the Shandong discovery, the leadership initiated a massive national crackdown known as the Yanda, or the Strike Hard campaign. In the year 2000, this movement focused specifically on the abduction and sale of women and children. Thousands of agents were deployed to the rural transport hubs, and the penalties for trafficking were increased to include the possibility of execution. The government was determined to erase the syndicate forever. The Strike Hard campaign of 2000 resulted in the rescue of hundreds of individuals who had been held in domestic servitude. The investigation into the well eventually led to the arrest of the ringleaders, who were operating out of a nondescript warehouse in a neighboring district. The trial was swift, and the evidence found in the brickwork of the irrigation shaft served as the primary testimony for the prosecution against the leaders of the group. The farmer, Lee, could never bring himself to use that specific well again. He eventually filled it with stones and earth, creating a permanent mound that served as a silent monument to the 4 women who had been found there. The village of Shandong returned to its agricultural rhythms, but the story of the hidden tomb remained a part of the local heritage. It was a reminder that the cost of the new century's growth was often paid by those with the least. As the year 2000 came to a close, the nation reflected on the success of the crackdown. The social fabric was being repaired, and the trade in human beings was being pushed further into the light where it could be dismantled. The discovery in the well had been a moment of profound sorrow, but it had also been the catalyst for a national awakening. The truth had been pulled from the depths, and justice had finally been served for the Nameless Four. This concludes tonight's episode. 12 stories. 12 moments that should never have happened. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I will see you next time. Stay safe out there.